Welcome to our last Monday conference for this term. I'd like to start by welcoming everyone watching online, but also everyone here in this room. For those watching online, I will be speaking in English and Lois will be speaking in English as well. So if you'd like to hear another language, you can choose the interpreting channel that you prefer. We have many different languages on offer. Lois will be speaking for about 45 minutes today, and then we'll have the opportunity for you to ask questions. If you are watching online, you can ask your questions during in the chat, and we'll read them to Lois afterwards so that she can answer them for you. The theme of our Monday conference this term has been crisis and opportunity, and I think the format has shown that the concept of crisis is far more broad than just the pandemic or the climate crisis, those that we instantly associate with crisis, but it can also be many other things, and this week it is body image, the body image crisis. Dr. Lois Barnett is here from SOAS at the University of London with a talk entitled Healing Our Relationships with Our Bodies Through Fashion, Can We Solve the Body Image Crisis? Before I hand over to Lois, I'd like to maybe set the scene with a few of my own thoughts, what I thought when I first read Lois's title. I think people inherently feel a need to belong, to be accepted for who they are, and to see themselves reflected in images and norms around them. But it's very hard to belong when every image you see is either altered in a way that is impossible to replicate, or that is not a reflection of yourself or many others in society. So when I was growing up, it was very much photoshopping, but today with social media like Instagram and Snapchat, it's filters that really do iron out every last imperfection, every pore, every wrinkle, every line on your body. And that's what becomes the norm for us. And of course, these images that we're confronted with can impact our self-perception, our confidence, and our mental health, which is a crisis of sorts. So how can fashion play into this? Interestingly, when I first read your title, I was surprised because you say healing our relationship with our bodies through fashion. And I've always thought that fashion has damaged our relationship with our bodies, because for me it's always seemed so restrictive that only certain people are allowed to wear certain things, that we see, the clothes that we see presented to us are always presented on the same kind of body shape. And fashion choices are also constantly criticized depending on the body that's wearing them. So Billie Eilish, the famous singer, was commented on for wearing oversized clothing, but then when she decided to wear a corset, a Marilyn Monroe hairstyle for the Vogue cover, she was criticized very heavily for being overly sexual. So how can fashion solve the body image crisis? Well, there are maybe some moves in the right direction. I think many of you are familiar with Germany's Next Top Model or Britain's Next Top Model, America's Next Top Model. And for years, that's always shown us one kind of body shape. But Heidi Klum and Germany's Next Top Model are maybe moving in the right direction. This season, the season is entitled Diversity. And Heidi Klum has asked many different types of model to participate, so tall and short models between, I think, 154 and 195, so a wide range, many different shapes and sizes, dress sizes 30 to 54, and even different ages, from the youngest model being 18 and the oldest model 68, and different backgrounds and personalities. And that, to me, does seem like progress. But interestingly, a lot of designers who have always worked with Germany's Next Top Model refused to work with Heidi Klum this year for that very reason, which potentially is then a setback of sorts. Our speaker today, Dr. Lois Barnett, will talk to us about this link between fashion and body image, and is certainly more qualified than I am to do so. She holds a BA in Japanese Studies and an MA in Global Cinemas and the Transcultural, both from SOAS at the University of London. She was awarded her thesis in 2020 on Consuming the West, Audiences, Industries, Film and Fashion in Japan from 1923 to 1939. And her work particularly examines the interaction between the audience member and Japan's transnational film and fashion industries, focusing on the modern girl and the modern boy, which I think comes up in your presentation, the effect of the onset of sound cinema on costume in the Japanese cinema, and the role of body image in marketing sportswear on screen in the 1930s. And she is also a vintage fashion stylist and model. So Lois, I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say. You have the floor, but first we're going to listen to the consecutive interpretation. Thank you.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, es ist mir eine wahre Freude, Sie zur heutigen Montagskonferenz begrüßen zu dürfen, der letzten Montagskonferenz in diesem Semester. Im Rahmen unserer Konferenz haben wir uns dieses Semester dem Thema Krisen als Chance gewidmet. Wir haben gesehen, dass es hier nicht nur um die Corona-Krise oder auch den Klimawandel geht. Es gibt verschiedene Krisen. Sie können heute online an unserer Konferenz teilnehmen. Die Konferenz wird auf Englisch stattfinden. Falls Sie eine andere Sprache auswählen möchten, können Sie das mit der Verdolmetschungsfunktion bei Zoom tun. Der Vortrag unserer Rednerin wird ungefähr 45 Minuten lang sein. Danach werden wir noch Zeit haben für eine Frage- und Antwortrunde. Ihre Fragen können Sie auch während des Vortrags schon im Chat stellen und wir werden sie dann danach verlesen. Die heutige Rednerin ist Dr. Lois Barnett von der SOAS Universität London. Dr. Barnett wird uns mit dem Thema Selbstbild in der Krise, bietet Mode einen Ausweg vertraut machen. Ich würde zuerst aber auch gerne darüber sprechen, was mir durch den Kopf ging, als ich das Thema zum ersten Mal gehört habe. Ich denke, dass jeder Mensch ein Bedürfnis danach hat, angenommen zu werden, dass er sich akzeptiert fühlt und dass er sich auch wiedererkennt in den Medien. Das ist aber recht schwierig, denn jedes Bild, das man im Internet sieht, ist entweder gefotoshoppt und angepasst oder man sieht sich nicht darin wieder. Als ich jünger war, war Photoshop ein großes Thema. Heute sind es natürlich die sozialen Medien. In den sozialen Medien kursieren eine Vielzahl an Filtern und man erkennt keine einzige Falte, keinen Pickel, nichts, was natürlich ist. Diese Bilder können einen großen Einfluss auf uns haben, auf unsere mentale Gesundheit, darauf, wie wir uns selbst wahrnehmen. Die Frage hierbei ist jetzt, wie können wir Mode nutzen, um unser Körperbild zu heilen? Diese Verbindung zwischen den beiden Themen hat mich sehr überrascht. Denn ich dachte immer, dass die Modeindustrie sogar einen negativen Einfluss auf unser Körperbild hat. Ich dachte immer, dass die Modeindustrie uns einschränkt, denn es gibt verschiedene Kleidungsstile für verschiedene Körpertypen. Und normalerweise gibt es auch nur Models mit einem bestimmten Körpertyp, der in den Medien repräsentiert wird. Ein Beispiel ist zum Beispiel die Sängerin Billie Eilish. Sie wurde immer stark dafür kritisiert, dass sie eher weitere Kleidung trägt. Dann hat sie sich dazu entschlossen, ein etwas engeres Outfit zu wählen und hatte ein Korsett an im Marilyn Monroe-Stil. Dann wurde sie dafür natürlich auch kritisiert. Wie kann man das Problem also angehen? Ich denke, dass es schon jetzt viele richtige Schritte in die richtige Richtung gibt. Ein Beispiel wären zum Beispiel TV-Programme wie Germany's Next Topmodel oder auch Britain's Next Topmodel oder America's Next Topmodel. Für viele Jahre sah es wie folgt aus. Viele junge Mädchen mit dem gleichen Körpertyp, mit dem gleichen Aussehen, mit dem gleichen Hintergrund. Jetzt gehen wir in eine richtige Richtung und versuchen, Diversität zu verbreiten. Große Mädchen, kleinere Mädchen, verschiedene Konfektionsgrößen, verschiedene Altersklassen und auch verschiedene Herkünfte werden jetzt in diesen Formaten präsentiert. Das ist meiner Meinung nach ein richtiger Schritt in die richtige Richtung. Dabei ist nur traurig, dass viele Designer, die zuvor mit der Sendung zusammengearbeitet haben, jetzt entschlossen haben, nicht mehr teilzunehmen. Diese Verbindung zwischen Körperbild und Mode wird auch von unserer heutigen Rednerin Dr. Barnett angesprochen. Sie hat einen Bachelor in Japan-Studien abgelegt, genauso wie einen Master in globalem Kino und dem Transkulturellen, beides mal an der SOAS Universität in London. 2020 hat sie promoviert zum Thema das Konsumieren des Westens, Publikum, Branchen, Film und Mode in Japan 1923 bis 1939. Sie hat hier vor allem einen Fokus gelegt auf die Interaktion zwischen dem Publikum als Konsument und der japanischen Film- und Modeindustrie zwischen 1923 und 1939. Des Weiteren geht sie auch auf die sogenannten modernen Frauen und modernen Männern oder auch Moga genannt ein. Sie geht auch auf die Nutzung von Kostümen in der Filmindustrie ein, genauso wie Sportbekleidung und gemischten Modestil bei Herren. Sie arbeitet außerdem auch als Vintage-Model. Ich freue mich sehr auf Ihren Vortrag. Dankeschön.
Thank you very much for such a lovely introduction, and thank you very much to the university. Oh, am I okay? Can you? Yeah, okay to proceed. Lovely, thank you. So thank you very much for such a lovely introduction. I think that was such a great summary of what I'd like to speak about today, and really, really relevant, and really gives a good setting of the scene what we're going to be speaking about today. And a big thank you to the University of Heidelberg for having me. It's a great pleasure to speak to you today about how we're going to heal our relationships with our bodies through fashion. Can we solve the body image crisis? And as you said, I'm from the School of Oriental and African Studies, part of the University of London. So first of all, I think maybe it's important for you to know who I am, what I actually do. So as you've said, I'm an academic, so I'm a specialist specifically in the interaction between Western and Japanese fashion and the interaction between the cinema and fashion industries in the 1920s and 1930s. I'm also a statistically average-sized fashion model. I'm the same size as the average woman in the United Kingdom. We'll talk a bit more about that a bit later on. I'm also a body-positive fashion stylist, particularly focusing on vintage-style fashions from the 1920s onwards. I'm also a freelance fashion writer, so writing for fashion publications. And I'm a campaigner for a more inclusive, sustainable and fair fashion industry. So particularly I'd like to speak about diverse representation in commercial industry and also about diversity within the industry. So actually having the people who are actually creating our clothes, who are designing our clothes, who are selling our clothes and who are modelling our clothes, having a more diverse representation within that too. And involved within that we also have the idea of more fair and sustainable working practices. And if you would like to, you can of course follow me on Instagram at Lois J. Elise. Little plug for you there, where I document all of these things and you can see a little bit more how these things all fit together. And you may think, okay, none of that really makes any sense. How does all that work? Well, I'm going to tell you a little story so that all makes a bit more sense for you, and I'll show you how that fits into how I understand the body image crisis. So what is the body image crisis? Well, we have a few different definitions of what crisis may be. So there's two which I've selected, which I think are very relevant to how I understand the body image crisis, which is a time of intense difficulty or danger, which I think is probably the definition of crisis, which most immediately comes to mind for us, or a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. And also thinking about body image, I think it's very important to really think about what body image means. And this is from a body image charity, not body image charity, a eating disorder charity. And they define it as how you see yourself when you look in the mirror or when you picture yourself in your mind. So it's something which is very internal, how you interpret the external in an internal way. And of course this can be positive, so you can think, yeah, I'm looking good today, I feel great about myself, I have a good positive body image, and that's what we want to see. Or unfortunately you can have a negative body image, which can hold feelings of shame, of anxiety, of self-consciousness. And people who experience high levels of body satisfaction feel their bodies are flawed in comparison to others and can experience feelings of depression, isolation, low self-esteem, and unfortunately, of course, eating disorders. And I really want you to think more about this idea of comparison. I think that's really where we want to think about the idea of comparing your own image of your body, how you think of yourself, how you see yourself, with the images that you see around you which are being presented to you. So why are we in crisis? How do we know we're in a crisis? I've got some statistics for you here, and wherever possible, I've tried to bring you some very recent statistics, because unfortunately, I think a lot of the research on body image is actually a little bit older, and it's actually a situation which is changing quite rapidly. There's a lot of different developments, which we'll speak a bit more about later. So some of these are from the YouGov survey, which was in the UK. That's a government survey from 2021. So 9 in 10 participants from their survey think that those who are better looking are treated more favourably, with 16% saying looks have a great deal of impact on a person's character. So it's the belief that if you look better, whatever better may mean, that you'll be treated better. That essentially you'll have a better life. People will treat you better. You may be treated more favourably when it comes to employment. you may be offered a job because people think you look better, those kind of situations. Of course, that puts huge pressure on you to think, you know, I need to look the best I can because you think your life will be better if you look better. 6 in 10 of these Britons that they surveyed, 61%, reported they feel how secure they feel about their body has had an impact on their own sexual relationships. So it's how you interact with others, and obviously, particularly in very intimate settings, your body's hugely important, particularly in that context, and that can have a real effect on your overall self-esteem and how you're feeling yourself. And half of Britons reported feeling under pressure to have the perfect body. So that's half. So that's out of every 2 people, at least one of those people, it's actually slightly over, it's 51%, are feeling that pressure that they have to be perfect. And I think it's that word perfect which is particularly heavy in that context. And this is something which is very gendered, and this is something I'll speak a bit more about later on. So 61% of women were significantly more likely than men to say this. But I'd still like to think that actually this is something which is not just affecting women. And I think we sometimes think of it as a women's issue. And something through my research that I really want to drive home is the fact this is something that affects everybody, not just men, not just women, not just people who associate themselves with genders outside of that binary. This is something that affects everyone. And I really want to see more research that looks into that rather than thinking of this as a women's issue. But a lot of the research is about women's issues, but we can still use that to kind of see how this is a crisis, how this is something which is of such a great gravity. So by age 6, girls especially start to express concerns about their own weight or shape, and 40 to 60% of elementary school girls from ages 6 to 12 are concerned about their weight. These are literal children. So to give you an idea of how far-reaching this is, we've talked about adults, we've talked about sexuality, it's even affecting children. It's something which is really early onset. It's something which literally, from the moment that you are aware of your body and the fact your body may look different to other people, you start to notice these differences, and somehow these differences are perceived as wrong. And over 1/2 of teenage girls and nearly 1/3 of teenage boys use unhealthy weight control behaviours, such as skipping meals, fasting, smoking cigarettes, vomiting and taking laxative, which I'm sure we all can agree aren't great things to be doing. And again, we see here it's about teenage boys as well. This is not a women's issue. And something that was very much mentioned in Aoife's introduction, which I thought was very poignant, is the idea of fashion, media and body image intersecting. And so back to the YouGov UK survey from 2021, most Britons share the view that the media is promoting unattainable perceptions of body image for both men and women. More than 8 in 10 think this applies to women. Again, we're looking at that female bias here, and 2/3 say this goes for men. So it's something that affects everybody. I think we can all kind of agree here that the feeling is that we kind of already know that the media isn't something at the moment which is promoting a positive body image for people. We can all kind of already agree on that. So we know it's a problem. Maybe it's time we dealt with it. Because only 5% think fashion companies have had a positive impact on the perception of body image. So you have this hugely influential set of organisations, I think we call them, with this widely agreed negative impact, yet only 5% of them think it's something positive. There's a huge kind of weight there. So using social media for as little as 30 minutes a day can negatively change the way that young women view their own body. And that was from 2015. So what I would really like to do is actually revisit that, because obviously that's quite an old statistic. I'm arguing possibly that maybe that's something which affects everyone. I think maybe we need to have more into that, but that's a little statistic there. So just 30 minutes of scrolling through your phone, that can change how you perceive your own body because you're bombarded with these images. So we're going to speak a bit more about that very shortly. So I think it's important to kind of tell you how my research is relevant, because obviously, first and foremost, I'm a fashion historian. And I think sometimes we think, oh, because something's very old or something's on the other side of the world, it's not necessarily relevant to these very current issues, these issues which are affecting all of us, which is something I really want to drive home. So how did I end up doing what I do now? So over here, if I can get this thing working, there we go. So this is Kurada Seiki, and he is a Meiji-era Japanese portrait artist. And he decided to paint a picture of himself wearing a Turkish cap. And I was a student of Japanese at the School of Oriental African Studies. I remember seeing this image and just thinking, why is this Japanese man in 1889 painting himself wearing a Turkish hat? Why is he doing that? And that was really what kind of made me think, what is the relationship between what we wear and how we view ourselves, and how we present that view of ourselves to other people? And again, he's got a beret on here, we all like a good beret. And yeah, so he was choosing to kind of present this idea that I'm someone who's very knowledgeable about Western art, I'm someone who's very cultured, through the choice of headwear that he was painting himself with. So he was very clearly kind of drawing himself through his clothing. And there's also lots of much later interactions between Japanese fashion and what we think of as Western fashion. So I was particularly inspired by David Bowie and his relationship with Kansai Yamamoto, who designed all these Ziggy Stardust costumes. And so that was what really kind of made me think, I really want to understand more about this relationship between fashion and how we present ourselves, how we see ourselves, and also that idea that it's a global issue. It's not something which is just about, I think, Western fashion. So what do I mean by Western fashion? I've used that term a few times now. So over on this side over here, this is a wedding photograph from around the 1920s. And you'll see here that we have a lady in a kimono, which is a very kind of square garment. It's a garment which is made of several different rectangles. Whereas you can see here, this gentleman that she's marrying, he's got his suit on, which is something which is very fitted to his body. It's something which really emphasizes his body shape, and it adheres to that. We also have in the middle here, this is the equivalent of a Japanese flapper. This is a modern girl. And they were very kind of racy, very kind of daring women in the 1920s in Japan, mainly in the major cities, so Tokyo and Osaka. And again, she is wearing a dress, and again, it's something which is very fitted to the body. And so it's that idea of meaning being generated through the clothing that you're wearing. So with a kimono, you've got these various square shapes, and that's something which is determining the meaning through the fabric. So it may say your social status, it may say what kind of occasion it is, it may say what the season is, depending on what the actual motifs are on the fabric. So she's got all of these cranes, which are associated with prosperity, because she's getting married. Whereas with Western clothing, it's all about the silhouette. It's about how your clothing's actually cut to fit you and what it emphasizes about your body. And that's what kind of gets that message across about the formality, about your social status, about what kind of event perhaps that you're wearing that thing to. And I think what really kind of emphasizes that, so over here, on this side over here, we have Tada Kenzo, and he was a motorbike racer for Japan. And he's wearing his hakama trousers, he's got his Hari jacket on, his Geta sandals on, and he's just literally got off his motorbike at the Isle of Wight TT in 1930. And so it's not that idea of kind of wearing something in particularly Japanese or Western spaces. It's that idea of the actual meaning of the garment. So he's decided to kind of go, you know what, I'm in a very kind of westernized setting. I'm at this motorbike race, but I want to represent where I am from and who I am through my clothing. So it's not necessarily about where something's made. It's about how it's constructed, because obviously you'd have Western clothing being made in Japan by Japanese tailors, but it's following this silhouette which is fitted to the body. So that makes sense to kind of talk about, about Japan and Japanese history, and I've told you all about that. Where does the body image stuff come from? Because again, you're probably thinking, oh, okay, well, that's all great, you just yacked on about Japanese history. What's this got to do with body image today? So to cut a very, very, very long story short, at the same time that I was looking at these images of these Japanese painters painting themselves in berets and expressing how cultured they were through the fascinating hats that they were painting themselves in, I was also appearing in a light entertainment television show known as Take Me Out, which I understand is also in Germany, which is very exciting. I learnt this over the weekend. And yeah, this was something I ended up doing almost entirely by accident. I was actually working to support my studies in the passenger boat industry in London, or Windsor, which is very close to London. And yeah, I ended up on this programme purely by accident, to be honest. Maybe we can talk about later on if you're interested in that, but I think we're kind of going off topic a bit. And as you can see, the women who are featured on this programme are all very, very glamorous women. They're very conventionally glamorous women. A lot of them are beauty queens, a lot of them are models, actresses, very glamorous women. And the way that they're presented is in these very kind of pretty, glamorous, you know, very almost exaggerated, glamorous styles. And that's me with the big arrow pointing at my head. And you can see kind of where I fitted in. And this is what I looked like back then. As you can see, I look a little bit different, but I'm roughly the same kind of size that I was. And over on the right-hand side, we have Cheryl Cole. This is in 2012. This is 10 years ago now. I can hardly believe it. And the thing is that obviously most of the women on this programme very much fitted the 2012 beauty standard. They were generally very tall. They were generally very slim. And they looked like this lady here. Whereas I was someone who was average-sized. I'm 5'4" and a size 14. I've got all my statistics in a minute, which is very exciting for you to read. And also it's about how I presented myself, how I put myself across. So I had this very deep voice, which I still have today. My voice hasn't changed pitch. But I also had a very strong accent. That is something which has softened over the years. It's not quite as strong as it was. And it was the accent which is kind of related to kind of a more lower class accent is probably the best way to describe it. And I was seen as having quite a masculine trait. So I used to kind of make sort of silly jokes about things. And my job was obviously I was a passenger boat captain. So I was kind of your hurly-burly sailor girl. That's pretty much who I was. And I also had these kind of like weird, quirky talents. So I could play an instrument called the theremin, which you haven't come across the theremin before. It's so when you watch these old sci-fi films, you have the woo noise. It's the thing that does that. So not exactly your ordinary hobby. And I could speak Japanese and all these other weird and wonderful things. I was not there to be a glamorous girl, is the very short answer. That's a real summary of what I want to say here. I was not there to be glamorous, I was not there to be a beauty queen, I was there to entertain people, make people laugh, and I had a lot of fun doing it, and I did enjoy doing it, and I was treated very well, I want to say that, very openly. But what was I criticised for? I was mainly criticised for what I looked like. And it was focused around my body. I was too short, I was too fat. My masculinity that was perceived by the audiences was very threatening. So my voice was too deep, my humour was too brusque, and my arms were too muscular. And I was featured too often on screen. So women who rarely spoke but fit the desirable aesthetic at the time were much preferred. How do I know all these things? Because people would just literally tell me. I was online, I was on things like Facebook, and I'd literally have things that are like these comments directly sent to me, which obviously is not something you really expect. You don't realise when you take part in a game show for a bit of fun that you are going to actually have these things bombarded to you. It's not even like when people are saying something on like Twitter or something like that where you have to kind of actively look for it. These are things that are directly sent to you. And actually I found it quite fascinating. I actually started just kind of to think a little bit about why does this matter? Because bear in mind, I was literally on TV for about not even half an hour every week, not even half an hour, yet people were feeling compelled that they had to send me these things or say these things about me. And that really is where my interest in body image really began to stem from. This is what I look like. I am 5'5" tall. And I am a size 14. The average female body in the UK is 5'5" tall, so the same height as me, and is a size 16. So slightly larger than me, but same height, and we're roughly the same. You can see this is what I looked like then. I don't look that much different now, and I'm roughly the same sort of size. So what really hurt me was the fact that people were saying these things to me, and I wondered, would the people who said these things about me say the same things about all the women they knew in person who are my size? So their sisters, their mothers, their girlfriends, their wives. If it's the average woman, if you say it about me, you're saying about most of the people that you know. And many of these commentators who were saying this about me were actually other women who, in honesty, either looked the same as me or they were larger. So was there some kind of internalised misogyny involved? I actually began to analyse this situation. Rather than just being hurt by it, I wanted to understand it. And it really made me question my own identity and how I represented myself through my fashion. So was I really as masculine as everyone made out? Was my feminine appearance somehow jarring because of this? Because I was just as glamorous as all the other girls. I loved having my makeup done and my hair done and my big shoes. Loved all that. But somehow, because my voice didn't fit with that aesthetic, that was somehow offensive. People didn't understand it, and it provoked these reactions. And I'd always been a tomboy. Was I feminine the wrong way? Was I doing it wrong? And was I not allowed to represent myself in this feminine way? Was this a space, was I somehow pushing myself into a space that I wasn't welcome in? And this really made me think about the idea of Hollywood fat. Because this is one of the things that was actually said about me that actually a very lovely friend decided to send to me. And I say friend quite sarcastically there. This is something someone said to me on Twitter. Someone bumped into me in a train station and wanted a photograph with me. And they said, in real life, Lois is really pretty. And I found that somehow more hurtful than the other things that have been said to me that are much more hurtful. Yet I noticed there were very similar things being said by actresses who we think of as being cast in conventionally unattractive roles. So this is a quotation from America Ferrera, who you probably know from Ugly Betty. And she said, I didn't even know I was fat until I started acting. I didn't know how fat and ugly I was until I started going on auditions. To me, it seems like the roles that mean something are roles that are flawed and the roles that nobody else wants to play. And these are both actresses who are very average-sized, very normal-looking, very beautiful women who are always cast as fat. So you think about things like Bridget Jones, and Ugly Betty, I think, is a great example as well, and the Sisterhood of the Travelling Pants. They're not presented in beautiful frames. And obviously, these are actually quite old films we're talking about here, so 2005 and 2001. So that's one of the other questions I kind of have, is that something that's changing, and is it something we can help to facilitate changing? And this is all the girls that appeared on the same series as me. There were 30 of us in total, and I think what really kind of drove home to me that actually it wasn't my body that was the problem is the fact that every single one of these women that you see here received pretty horrible abuse online. Every single one of them, and these were lovely, kind, beautiful, multifaceted women. Like, every one of these girls was wonderful. And very, very much kind of a conventionally beautiful woman as well, every single one of them. And they still had really vile things said to them and about them online. So even if you were, so for talking, say, one of the girls who looked like, I showed you the actress Cheryl Cole earlier, if you looked like her and you didn't speak too often and you spoke, you know, in a pretty way and you had the right accent, you would still have horrible things said about you. You could not win. And that's what made me realise that actually our bodies were never the problem. They were not the problem. It was how that we were seeing them and framing them. So we're going to fast forward to a bit. So I've just finished Take Me Out. I've now gone back to university and I've learned all about how Japanese artists were painting themselves wearing nice hats. And then I decided to take a class in Japanese cinema. And that's where I learn about 1920s and 1930s Japan. And I realised that actually a lot of the actresses from this time were actually treated very similarly to how I was treated. So you had these women who were generally brought in from the countryside, and they were quite kind of, they were basically brought in to kind of fit the Western style dresses effectively. And they were chosen to do with their accents. Quite often they had regional accents, quite strong accents. And that was something which became somewhat of a trend. And also, because they were young actresses from the countryside, they were easy to manipulate as well. That made them very attractive to the film industries, because you could pretty much do whatever you liked with them. And again, you have a lot of controversy about how these women spoke, about how they were seen as something which was simultaneously very attractive and very racy, but also something which was very much feared. And you see so many kind of comments on their body. And so one of the things that came up in my experience when I went to Take Me Out was the correlation between how I looked and how I spoke, and the idea that I spoke too often for a girl that didn't fit the desired beauty standard. And this is from another Western style artist in Japan at the time who painted the painting right here. And he said, when dressed in Japanese costume, women must behave according to Japanese customs of modesty and quiet, and it is wrong for them to imitate American movie actresses. So it's the idea that what you wear and how you present yourself through fashion actually changes the way that you are perceived, and that, you know, you should be quiet and you should be dressed quietly. And I thought that was something that really resonated with me. I realised it's the same processes. And that's what kind of drove home to me the idea of fashion as a cultural universal. So it's that idea that we all have to get dressed effectively, and every single society in the world has to get dressed. You can't just opt out of fashion. It's something you can't completely remove yourself from. No matter what you do, you're going to have to somehow code your identity through the clothing that you wear. And Elizabeth Wilson said that in all societies, the body is dressed, and everywhere dress and adornment play symbolic, communicative, and aesthetic roles. So I want you to think about kind of every single piece of clothing you wear is part of a system, and that system is specifically designed by essentially the fashion industries that all work together. So I'm going to show you a little clip from The Devil Wears Prada now, which I think really kind of illustrates that. So I hope you enjoy that.
This stuff? Oh, okay, I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. But what you don't know is that that sweater is not just blue, it's not turquoise, it's not lapis, it's actually cerulean. And you're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns. And then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets? I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
Thank you for that.
Truth is, there is no one.
It's probably a very good video as well. Thank you very much for that. So I think that I've got the transcript here so you could just see that. I think that demonstrates to you very well the idea that every single person is involved in fashion, whether they want to or not. And the idea that every single item that you wear has had a huge process behind it which gets it to you, and the way that then you use that to express yourself. And it's also that idea of a top-down system. So you have the consumer at the very bottom of the chain, so all of us in this room, and then above that you have all these various other levels of that, and it's from the top down. So you have high fashion, so you have the big fashion houses, and then it trickles down through to the fast fashion system, and then to us buying it at the very bottom. So even if you think, oh, I'm distanced from that, you aren't really. You're still part of that system. And so it's very hard to escape fashion. If fashion is something which is going to sell you something damaging, it doesn't matter whether you're buying Chanel or if you're buying C&A. It doesn't matter. You're still buying into the same ideal. And so what I really want to emphasize is that idea of fashion being a semiotic signifier on screen in the media. So in my work, in my thesis, I talk about the Saussurean approach to semiotics, which takes into account an immediacy of meaning. So a sign, in this instance clothing, can never be totally meaningless, I can speak English, with its meaning being shaped by the material circumstances in which it appears. So in short, every single thing has meaning. It's never just a dress, and it's shaped by the context around it, whether that's a context involved in the advertising or the spaces in which it's worn. So again, this may seem a little bit bizarre to you, but I promise you it will make sense. This is the idea of a dematerialization process. This is from my research in the 1920s and 1930s in Japan. So you start off with that actual object. So you have here a shoe or cosmetics product over here. There we go. So this is from Shiseido, very famous Japanese cosmetic company, and it's a pair of Western-style shoes. Then you have the actual cinema itself. So you see these actual shoes or cosmetic products, clothing on screen, in films, or in, so we're going to talk about social media shortly. And you have that idea that you kind of see that, you see the space it's in, so it's worn by a particular star, it's shown in a particularly glamorous or beautiful way, and then you actually have the actual products that you can buy. So you have the same product that's on screen, or things that are made to look like that product that you can then buy in spaces. And then added to that, you have this idea of images of those products. So in the Japanese context, you would have all of these various posters, or you'd have magazines. So if you weren't bombarded with the actual product itself, so walking through a department store for talk's sake and seeing the shoes there, you would also see all the posters, you'd see all the magazines, and you would obviously be passing these magazines around between you. And of course, that's something that's completely exacerbated in our current context, because actually we have this process happening in our phones. We are carrying this process around with us all the time. And the moment you open your phone, you're immediately bombarded with something saying, hey, here's a thing you can buy, and here's the way it's made beautiful or impressive or wonderful. And what I really want to think about is the bodies that we use to do that process. And obviously, this is all intensified to such a strong level. So Marilyn Doan describes a self-identification process initiated by the cinematic space, which links this to consumerism. And she says that in her desire to bring the things of the screen closer, to approximate the bodily image of the star, and to possess the space in which she dwells, the female spectator experiences the intensity of image as a lure and exemplifies the perception proper to the consumer. The cinematic image for the woman is both shop window and mirror, the one simply a means of access to the other. So really, how I want to summarize this to you is that the cinematic space was used as a means of utilizing the star image in order to inspire consumerism. And cinema's failure to truly replicate the present continues a process of dissatisfaction which drives consumption as part of a continuation of the uniquely modern experience, where the old and the new are constantly juxtaposed. And we have someone called Haratunian here, who particularly studies Japanese historical context, saying that the new is experienced as modern because the old and archaic are still around. So the moment you've seen it, it's old. So you think about, particularly in the social media context, it's rapid fire images, and that's becoming faster and faster all the time, particularly with things like TikTok, where you have these constant little videos over and over again. So again, you have the same process that's happening in Japan, in an Eastern country, nearly 100 years ago now. And we have the same thing happening, but faster and faster and faster and speeding up. So we also talked earlier about that idea of if you look better or you change your appearance to fit an ideal, that your life may somehow be better. And you see that exact same thing in the 1920s. So we talked a little bit about the modern girl, about the Japanese flapper. And this is a direct quotation from Shiseido Cosmetics. They had a magazine, so that company's still going today, and they decided to use Western-style imagery in order to market their cosmetic products. And they said that the modern girl is a young woman who holds modern beliefs. Particularly, I think it means a woman who chooses Western clothing over the kimono. You can see her intelligence shine out. Her individuality is made clear. In other words, she is a woman who shatters notions of a conventional appearance and recognizes herself through her clothing and cosmetics, and who beautifies herself as much as possible. So if you buy this product and you fit this aesthetic, then you're going to be all of these wonderful, fascinating, interesting, charismatic things. You're going to be individual, you're going to be cultured. So that's exactly the same thing that we're seeing today. And you also have this idea of beauty contests. So you have all of these dresses, which are made to fit a certain body shape, and you have these cosmetics, which are made to make you look like a film star. And obviously, a lot of the film stars in Japan at that time were chosen because they resembled Hollywood stars. So it's that idea of kind of shaping yourself to fit a Hollywood ideal at the same time. And you can actually see here, there's lots and lots of different body types here, in fairness. I will say, actually, this is quite a diverse selection, particularly from the 1930s. It's actually quite fascinating. And this was something which one of the commentators said. They said that more than a dozen women gathered to represent healthy body beauty, but the result was very disappointing. Those who truly do represent the healthy body beauty within the modern Japanese woman must be disheartened. Before, actresses with beautiful shapely legs were recruited at Kamata, which is one of the big studios. But from this point on, these so-called film actresses simply lack sophistication. Women like those back in the day just simply cannot be found. And this idea of beautiful, shapely legs is something which came from, I talked to you earlier about the women that were selected from the countryside. So they were quite rural, they were working, because they wanted them to wear short dresses. They wanted them to wear short dresses and, again, look like Hollywood women. And obviously, if you think about Japanese women, particularly at this time, they were generally quite short, they were very slim, and they were suddenly being told, you need to look like these quite muscular Western women. You have to completely change yourself. And that was through basically diet and exercise. And that's where this idea of healthy body beauty came from, which I'm sure you will agree is quite similar to some of the messages we're bombarded with today. And we have this idea of classification of bodies. And that's something which fits into the mass-manufactured ready-to-wear clothing model, which was marketed by the department store. And this allowed for the marketing of a variety of other products designed to allow women to more closely appropriate a fit and hygienic star body. And this meant that women's magazines began to contain fitness and diet advice, often using star bodies in order to encourage participation. So we talked earlier about the idea of body image being a process of comparison, and we could see that very directly here. So over here, this is the idea of the ideal model shape here. And this is what different Japanese women, they decided looked like. And they said, this is who you're most likely to look like over here. And this is how they actually suggested adapting your Western style clothing to emphasize different parts of your body. And this is very, very similar to the things that you see today about, kind of fixing body flaws. And it's that idea of kind of, oh, well, you can alter your clothes in order to fit this, but ultimately what we really want is you to alter your body to fit the clothes. That's much more something which is sold, really, because it allows you to sell these various other products. And it is quite interesting because you do actually see some of this self-awareness going on. People are aware of this. So you see this idea of kind of masculine style suiting. This is from 1935. And this is from a reader writing in saying, I would like to make myself a suit for the springtime. I am 5 feet 5 inches tall, which is actually quite tall in that context, with no curves. I will look like a man, and I believe I may look strange in a blouse, but I would still like to make myself one. And this is one of the very, very few examples you actually get of resistance. This is actually someone saying, you know what, I know this, I don't fit that standard, I know this kind of clothing isn't for me, but actually, you know what, I don't care, I'm going to make it. And people were obviously making their own clothes. That's something quite common at this time. So this is kind of finishing the section on my PhD thesis, and I think once I move on, you actually see how that makes more sense within the context of what we're talking about today. So star images provided a variety of purchasable types for the consumer to choose from, which are also harnessed by state narratives. So the healthy body beauty idea we talked about earlier, that was also something which was advocated by the state, because the idea was that if you have a healthy populace, a healthy, fit, strong populace, you actually have a healthy military presence. It's the idea that these women are going to be the mothers of the next generation who then help us to essentially expand our empire. So you have the state telling you need to make yourself fit and strong and healthy and bigger than you would usually be, and you also have the film industry enforcing that as well. So you've got it from all sides, you can't get away from it. You have the idea of self-identification with the star image, which appears to be consistent as a means of inciting male and female audiences to consume. So the quote I read you earlier from Marilyn Doan saying that the idea of shop window as mirror for women. In my research I found that was something that applied to men too. Men were also looking at images of male bodies and thinking, yeah, I don't measure up, how can I make myself measure up? And there were all these various products marketed towards them as well. And in terms of body-focused products, we see a lot of parallels to today's criticisms of body-focused marketing. And the relationship between poor body image and film and fashion marketing practices is not a Western or purely contemporary issue, and it has this huge global historical context. And many parallels can be found with social media marketing practices employed by the fashion and media industries today. So, for talking sake, you see product placement, the idea of dematerialization, so where you have this one product which begins life in a film or in a media context, and then is disseminated out through society because of those connotations which appear on screen. And you see that very much with influencers. And so we're going back to my experience on Take Me Out now, and we can actually see that same process being done to me. So in 2012, we have the beauty standard over here. We talked about Cheryl Cole. She's very tall, she's very thin, she doesn't say a lot. And then in 2014, only 2 years later, you have Kim Kardashian, who looks completely different. So Kim Kardashian is someone who is very curvaceous, she's very outspoken, and she will not be silenced, for better or for worse. And then you have, this is what I appeared on television in 2012. I'm sorry, Kim, if you're watching. So in 2012, this is when it was filmed. As you can see, I look nothing like her. I don't enormously like Kim Kardashian either, but I look a little bit closer to Kim Kardashian than I would have done to Cheryl Cole, in that I had a more curvaceous body shape. And I told you about all of the various criticisms that were made towards me in 2012, about being too fat and talking too much, and I shouldn't have been there, and I was too masculine. It was rerun in 2016, so after the onset of the Kardashian body type, for want of a better way of phrasing it, and I had a completely different reception. I had a lot of people saying, oh, wow, your dress looks amazing. That's such a gorgeous dress. Where did you get that from? And I was thinking, well, hang on a minute. First of all, I filmed this 2 years ago. The image had remained the same. This was the exact same program, but the reception had completely changed. It had been a complete about face. And this made me think again about, obviously I was doing my PhD at this point. I just joined the dots. I realized that actually, this was the same process that was happening in Japan. It's the exact same process. You were changing the beauty standard, which was changing the pressures which were put on the ordinary person that was actually out purchasing clothes and living their life, doing things which affected their body. And then it made me realise that plus-size modelling campaigns were so different to what we think of as high-fashion modelling campaigns. So if you think about what a plus-size model means, what is a plus-size model? A plus-size model is anyone who's not a straight-size model, which is what in the industry is when you think of like the catwalk models. So it's generally someone who is a UK size 8. I can't think off the top of my head what size that is in European sizing, but I can look that up for you if that's helpful. They're generally over 5'8" as well, so they're tall and they're very slim. A plus-size model starts at, I believe, a size 12. So that's one size smaller than me, and I'm the UK average size. So it's still not someone who represents average size women. And they also start at 5'8". These are also still tall women. And obviously a woman who is a size, let's say, size 16, so a size 42, who is 5'2", looks very different to a size 16 woman who is 5'8". They're proportioned completely differently. And it's also interesting to realise that they're actually represented in a completely different way. So on this slide here, we have the high fashion model over here. She's not smiling. She's posed in a very kind of artistic way, a very kind of louche way. And it's that kind of idea of fantasy. It's the editorial fantasy. And on the right-hand side here, you have the plus-size model. Well, first of all, do you really see a huge amount of size difference between these two women? Because I don't. There's not a lot in it. And they're presented in this very mundane setting. It's this very kind of everyday setting. It's nothing like a high fashion setting at all. It's the high fashion setting is the idea of fantasy, of otherworldliness, of aspiration, whereas the plus-size model, it's just, oh, well, she's out walking her dog, whatever, we don't care. And they're always smiling. It's this kind of inane kind of, everything's wonderful. It's never like something which is edgy, for want of a better word. And so with the experience that I had, and with the academic study that I had, and I wanted to kind of really illustrate this process that it's been going on for such a long time, I wondered, could we create high fashion images with an average size model? Could we take these same conventions, the stylistic conventions of high fashion photography, and apply that to an average size, not even plus size, an average size model? I wanted to see what it looked like when you put a quote unquote normal person, everyday person, into these modes. Because I wanted to say that basically these images could still sell clothes. That's really what I wanted to kind of test. So I decided to become a model. And I decided to test that out for myself. And if you like, we can talk about this. So we have the same stylistic modes here. And this was a really fascinating thing. So I realized actually, so this is for various different brands that I've worked with in the UK. And I actually, last year, I walked at London Fashion Week, which was a really quite amazing moment for me. Just the fact I was able to actually enter that space. That's something that, as a teenager, or even in 2012 when I was a Take Me Out girl, I don't think I could ever have achieved that. That's something I could never have envisioned, but it's changing so rapidly. So I think slowly brands are realizing that actually hurting people does not sell clothes. But the problem is, of course, I can only represent myself and bodies like mine, and people who relate their own identities to mine when I'm modeling. I can't represent people of colour, because this is me. I only have one face and one body. I can't represent people who are larger than me. I can't represent disabled people. And what I really want to see is all identities and bodies represented in fashion imagery. So if we go back to that idea that you see the star on screen, you relate to that star, you think, I want to own that space that star is in. I want to own that star's status through the clothing that they're wearing. That's the identity I want to project. I want to see people that look like the actual people buying clothes of all different kinds being able to engage with that process. And the only way to do that is to actually put genuinely diverse models out there, which I think was a really great point that Aoife demonstrated earlier. But of course, unrepresentative and potentially damaging fashion imagery is only one example of inequality in the fashion industry. So we're talking about body image today, but actually, if we think about how it hurts everyone, we need to intersect that with other problems, which also affect diversity. So things like unfair pay and working conditions, a lack of diversity in the industry itself, and the environmental impacts, which disproportionately affect underprivileged groups. So if you think about people working in sweatshops, if you think about the Rana Plaza disaster, these are all ways that fashion can still harm people. And I think you have to look at this intersectionally. So I think that's another area where I think we see that kind of trickle-down approach, and we need to implicate that in that way as well, in terms of the entire industry. That's the only way that we can make it kinder. And so what I'm proposing is, can we harness the power of fashion imagery for ourselves as consumers in order to change things? So we're going to go back to crisis, back to our definition of crisis from earlier, which was the idea of a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. And with the rise of user-generated content, so I talked a little bit about social media, we can decide. Now is our time that we make that decision about what media we consume, and to an extent, what images become popular. We can decide to become an agent for change. Because, of course, we are consumers. We're the people with the money. This is a money-related system. This is actually an economic problem as much as it's a social problem. And so if we decide, you know what, I'm not going to follow these various brands that are only using one kind of model or one kind of representation, or aren't using fair supply chains and practices, if we decide to remove that money and remove that influence, then they are forced to change, and we are directly seeing that. So if we think about the statistic I showed you earlier from 2015, about how 30 minutes of social media was enough to damage someone's perception of their own body, in particular that was looking at women, whereas I want to apply it to everybody, we actually can see something very different now. We do genuinely see more diversity. But the problem is when you have tokenism involved. And what I really want to see is, rather than kind of going, oh, well, I suppose we better have one person of colour or one person who's a bit bigger, we should be representing everyone. And I think the only way we can do that is to continue doing what audiences are already starting to do and actually retracting the influence from these quite damaging channels. So rather than seeing someone who's drastically altering their body or drastically altering the images they're putting out in general of products, because a lot of time the products themselves are as altered as the people are. So particularly when you think about things like fast fashion, even the quality is not great because it's not produced well, and it's obviously also adding into things like waste. By removing that, then we'll actually start to see more change. So we can decide what personalities and brands we expose ourselves to, and we can control that. And we control that through not just monetary ways, but also in terms of things like likes, which don't cost us anything. And so we have the idea of consumer-led fashion communities who share stories and experiences. Fashion is for all of us. So following on from the experiences that I had, I actually started my own fashion group on Facebook because I got fed up with people basically making comments on people's bodies, when actually most of us just wanted to talk about clothes and what made us feel good, what made us feel happy. And that's what really made me start to do styling as well. So I worked for a boutique in Mayfair, and I dealt with so many different women who had all of these perceived problems with their bodies. And I asked them to reframe that. Like, okay, well, what do you like in this room? What makes you happy? Oh, I like that colour over there. Well, why don't you try it on? Oh, I had a lady in her 60s, to show you the idea of age. I had a lady in her 60s going, oh, I can't wear purple. And I asked her why. And she said because a boyfriend told her she looked washed out when she wore it when she was 21. And I said, so you've been carrying that for your whole life? She goes, yes. I said, when did you last speak to him? Oh, I don't even remember. I said, why does someone's opinion of you that you don't even remember matter? And she put the dress on and she bought it and she loved it. And I think sometimes it's about kind of breaking through that and breaking through the hang-ups that we construct about ourselves, which really can heal our relationships. And not just in terms of things like whether a colour doesn't suit us, but particularly in terms of our body. It's about how something feels on you, how it makes you feel. That's so much more important. And I think that the imagery that we surround ourselves with is such a huge impact on that. And this idea of democratising fashion through these online communities allows marginalised groups to share their own experiences of fashion and create their own communities. So that disrupts that top-down industry model. We haven't got Miranda Priestley telling us what to wear anymore. We've got ourselves doing it. And I think what we really need to do is kind of harness that and keep doing that, keep that ball rolling, and take that influence away. And so we can also raise awareness of the industry, the issues in the fashion industry. So we promote the brands and personalities as alternatives to problematic entities. And that's, again, I talked about tokenism earlier. It's about rewarding genuinely diverse brands who genuinely have diverse practices rather than just tokenism trying to kind of jump on the train with that. But actually going, you know what, yeah, that is tokenistic, but this brand here is genuinely doing something positive, which then acts as a kind of example to the more established fashion brands. And ultimately what I really want to see is not just these kind of smaller niche fashion brands, but even larger brands responding to that. So, you know, one day maybe we'll see Chanel do a plus size collection. I think it could happen. And really what I want to see is us exposing ourselves to diverse images presented as fashionable and powerful, which reframes what we perceive as aspirational and beautiful. So kind of forget about this idea that, you know, it's just, if you're a plus size model, you should be out walking your dog smiling inanely, but actually put everybody in desirable spaces and desirable presentation. So vote with your money, but your social media costs nothing, and it has, I think, possibly even more influence at this point. And we are seeing that it's starting to listen. So here we have a billboard for the fast fashion brand Pretty Little Thing, which shows models of various sizes. And they all look a little bit different, which is great. You've got a few different heights here. And the problem is, of course, that that's only one thing. We talked about tokenism earlier. I think in some ways, unfortunately, this is an example of that, because you have, this is one billboard out of many where they decided to use plus-size models, which is fantastic. But it's just literally one little thing. It's going, oh, hi, you know, here's us being diverse, look at what we're doing, rather than actually looking at all the other various problems that are in their supply chain. So they're owned by Boohoo, which has had an alleged use of unethical labour practices. And this is just one fast fashion brand. We've seen it as like a top-down structure. The fast fashion brands do not have as much influence as the larger kind of haute couture houses have. So it's great seeing it from the fast fashion brands. That's brilliant to see, but you need to see that much more widely throughout fashion. I don't think we will have won, I suppose, for want of a better word, until you see the real kind of, you know, the LVMH brands, the Chanel brands really kind of doing that as well. But it's a great start. And I think one thing I'd kind of like to add as well is the idea that obviously high fashion isn't accessible to everybody. Of course it isn't. And, you know, it's great just to see fast fashion brands at least trying. I think trying is the word to use, but there's room to grow and room to kind of see that understanding deepen. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. I really appreciate that. And I'd be really delighted to hear any questions. Thank you very much.